My name's Wendy James. I am the founder and CEO of the Better World Group. My company manages California Delivers, which is a broad coalition of businesses, public health professionals, working families, equity organizations, community and faith leaders, environmental organizations, public officials, a very broad Big Tent coalition that supports the state's climate, clean energy, and clean transportation policies. We're here today to talk about California cap and trade revenues, how they're being invested, the benefits of the program, and where the program might be headed. We're fortunate to have with us some of the best and most strategic minds who are involved in this, from the private sector, the nonprofit sector, academia, and government. So we're covering all sectors here. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists to share some of their unique perspectives, have a little bit of exchange, and then I know there's a lot of interest in this, and you wouldn't have stuck it out if you didn't have some questions. So I want to make sure we reserve enough time for you to have questions. So I think we'll just go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is Ashley Conrad-Seda. Ashley is marking her 5th anniversary this month as Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy at Cal EPA. Prior to joining Cal EPA, Ashley served as California's Renewable Energy Program Manager for the United States Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management. Ashley.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for being here late in the day to close us out. I'll basically set us up and just share some basic statistics about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the cap and trade auction proceeds. You'll see that we use those words interchangeably, and where the money's gone and the types of benefits we're seeing. We submit a report to the legislature every March, and so one came out just last month, and so I'll just be sharing some statistics from that. And then when we get to the Q&A, we can talk a little bit more about where we're going and what that means for California. So just to set the groundwork here, California Climate Investments or Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund or the cap and trade auction proceeds, whatever you'd like to call them, they're part of our overall climate strategy to reduce our emissions. We have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the expenditures of these funds. About $4.4 billion has been deposited into the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and that's the state's portion of the cap and trade auction proceeds. From Adam, you'll hear more about the electricity portion. And as you see, there's lots of names here, so I might say GGRF too. But in the governor's climate change pillars that came out, you've heard about these in other sessions, but that were announced 2.5 years ago, and then also through Executive Order B 3015, we have these goals to reduce emissions across multiple sectors. And so as a result, we actually use our climate investments to achieve those reductions across all of those sectors. So transportation, energy, sustainable communities, natural resources, waste diversion, water, energy efficiency, housing, things like that. But it is the investment plan that we put together every 3 years on how we spend these investments. It's a really big portion of our climate work, and really requires interagency work at the state level, huge amounts of stakeholder engagement to make sure that we're hitting the right notes with our investments, and a lot of work with the legislature to make sure that the governor's ideas on where the money should go is actually heard and appropriated by the legislature as well. And there's kind of a back and forth between the governor's office, the administration, and the legislature. So I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides that you all already know. Oops. So as I mentioned, there's $4.4 billion raised since 2012, our first auction at the end of 2012. State agencies can appropriate the funds, and then they can administer programs that are grant-related or direct expenditures, but all of them must reduce greenhouse gas emissions and further the purposes of AB 32. Let's see. And as I mentioned, the legislature appropriates funds consistent with the 3-year investment plan, and that was written into a bill called AB 1532 a few years ago. And then the investment minimums come from 2 separate bills, so SB 535 and AB 1550, in terms of how we invest in disadvantaged communities. We are also directed to maximize co-benefits, so economic, environmental, and public health co-benefits. I'll skip through some of these. So this is the funding status that just came out in our report. $3.4 billion appropriated so far, which means there's still about $1 billion in the fund. $1.4 billion awarded by agencies and $1.2 billion in implemented projects so far. And here's just an example of some of the appropriations to date in each of the sectors. So we have 3 major sectors: transportation and sustainable communities, and that represents a large portion of the continuously appropriated funds. So about 60% of the funds are continuously appropriated, and they all fall into this bucket. So you'll see a large amount invested in this area. And then clean energy and energy efficiency. Fortunately, we have a lot of clean energy and energy efficiency programs around the state. And so this portion is a little bit smaller. It's a smaller source of emissions for the state as well. And then the final area is natural resources and waste diversion, about equal in terms of investments to the energy side of things. And again, about equivalent to the types of emissions we're seeing from this sector. But you'll see it's very diversified. A lot of different agencies manage these programs, and we have about 47 different programs going on at any given time. So far, we actually are seeing real emission reductions from the implemented projects. And we don't count these emission reductions as necessary for achieving our goal. These are all additional to our goal. So it's really critical that we continue to get these emissions reductions, because not only are we getting the reductions through the cap and trade program, but then through the proceeds, we're getting more reductions. And so it's really a double bang for our buck, which is great. But you can see there's a side for high-speed rail, and then there's a side for all of the other emissions reductions. And the high-speed rail numbers are calculated out through the lifetime of the project. When it comes to investing in disadvantaged communities, and we'll be talking about that a lot today, these are our targets right now. So for SB 535, our minimum investment is 10% within disadvantaged communities as established by CalEnviroscreen, and then 25% providing benefits to disadvantaged communities. And then what we've seen so far is that we've actually done a pretty good job of this. We've invested 34% within disadvantaged communities, and we've benefited communities with about 50% of the funds. So we're exceeding our targets. And you can see here, 90% of the disadvantaged community census tracts have received funds. So we're pretty happy so far with what we've seen, but we always have more work to do to make sure these investments are meaningful and providing the types of benefits that communities would like to see. We now have a new law, AB 1550, that was passed last year. And the way the legislation was written, we are supposed to start this new tactic with the next investment plan, but we think that may have been somewhat of a legislative drafting error. So we're starting earlier, and we are hoping to begin implementing AB 1550 with any appropriations that occur this year. And many of you probably would know this, but the investments for, if there are any appropriations this year, we would like them to be accompanied by a 2/3 vote to basically confirm the authority of ARB to administer the cap and trade program. So we'll see what happens with the budget, and if we go beyond the budget, to make sure that we can actually see additional investments coming into communities. We really want to avoid uncertainty and make sure that these investments continue, because these programs have been very well received, and communities are starting to develop some dependencies on them. So AB 1550 increases the amount to be spent within communities to 25%, and then it also does some outreach to low-income communities. So those communities that don't light up as part of CalEnviroscreen as having both pollution and population burdens, but that are traditionally low-income according to 2 different data sets. So basically that's 5% within low-income communities and households anywhere in the state, and then 5% in low-income communities and households within a half-mile of a disadvantaged census tract. And so it's actually taken us about 4 months to parse that legislative language and figure that out, and many, many public meetings. So there's a chance that when the legislature sees how we're interpreting this and the guidelines come out that we're trying to figure out how to spend it, there's a chance we may get some additional language that gets at the real intent of the bill, but we're trying to interpret it to the letter of the law. So we've done a lot of outreach to disadvantaged communities, as I mentioned, and just a lot of public meetings along the way. I'm going to skip through some of this to make sure we have some time. So here's just some examples of co-benefits of California climate investments. We've seen job creation and training, reductions in criteria and toxic air pollutants, reductions in vehicle miles traveled, and a lot of fuel and energy cost savings in households. And then here are some programs that we're investing in, but transit-oriented affordable housing through the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program out of the Strategic Growth Council. Active transportation, this year we put out $10 million in active transportation funds. Transit and interconnectivity projects that are part of the continuous appropriation. And then urban forestry and greening. Kaylee is here in the audience, but he's working on the $80 million urban greening proposal or program that we just appropriated this past year. Residential programs are, direct benefits within households, so weatherization and solar, clean vehicles, and for some rural communities, we're investing about $5 million in wood smoke reduction. So there's, agencies continually come to us with interest in funding new programs, and the way it works is the Air Resources Board and Cal EPA takes a look at those programs to make sure there's the GHG emission reduction nexus and make sure there's consistency with our investment plan, and then works with the governor's office to really say, is this an investment that the community wants, that the agencies want? And so it's a continual give and take between the agencies, the public, the legislature, to make sure that we're really finding the best investments that get us these greenhouse gas emissions reductions, the disadvantaged community benefits, and then all of those co-benefits that we're trying to find. So I will stop there, and we can.
Great. You can keep that. Thanks, Ashley. That was a great overview. Our next speaker is Alvaro Sanchez. He is the Director of Environmental Equity for the Greenlining Institute, which is really one of the most respected nonprofits in the state, if you're not familiar with them. Alvaro is an urban planner, and for more than a decade, he's been working on economic and land use issues throughout California and nationally to spur economic development in impacted communities. So your slides are up. Alvaro, take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Buenas tardes. Congratulations to you for making it this far. This is the best panel that you've been on, so I can't, believe that everybody else is not here. I'm with the Greenlining Institute, and this is a policy, advocacy, and leadership organization based in Oakland. But all our work is with a statewide focus. And we envision a nation where race is not a barrier to economic opportunity, and where everybody has an opportunity to thrive. And as the Director of Environmental Equity, we believe that something amazing is happening in California. We're charging polluters for the damage that they cause and using that revenue to uplift our communities with good jobs, with improved health, and with clean energy investments in communities that otherwise would not see those. And of course, this didn't happen overnight, or it didn't happen just with one effort. A broad coalition of organizations have worked tirelessly for many years to make sure that we kind of ensure that as California implements bold climate policies, we do so with equity at the center of that. And the bills that Ashley just mentioned, AB 1550 and SB 535, is one of those bills, two of those bills. We were really involved in making sure that this was a priority for the state, that as we generated revenue from cap and trade, we ensured that those investments were going to the communities that are most impacted by pollution and are first and worst hit by climate change. So you're going to see a little bit of overlap between what I have to say and a little bit of what Ashley mentioned. But I want to really give you a taste of what these projects are looking like on the ground and some of the benefits that we've been able to generate. So as we heard, cap and trade has generated a tremendous amount of revenue, and I think my slide is a little incorrect. $3.4 billion have been generated for a variety of programs, as you just heard. And the work of this broad coalition is ensuring that these investments have a direct benefit in disadvantaged communities. So of the many programs that Ashley mentioned, we know that 14 of them, 50% of their revenue counts as benefiting disadvantaged communities. And 4 of them, 100% of the revenue they receive, are actually located in disadvantaged communities. This includes things like urban forestry and urban greening, renewable energy through solar for single-family homes, and some of the electric vehicle programs that the state administers. So this is combined represents about $377 million of revenue that's been targeted at these communities. And of course, as you heard, we have specific set-asides to ensure that this revenue is going to these communities. And so far, the state has been performing fairly well in terms of making sure that this investment is going to the most impacted communities. And we want to see that continue moving forward. But of course, the main purpose of these policies is not to generate revenue. In fact, if we didn't generate any revenue and we were reducing pollution, particularly in the most impacted communities, we'd be completely happy with that. The purpose of this work is not for us to enrich our communities by using pollution as a way to leverage that revenue. So moving forward, as we continue to debate kind of the future of some of these policies, it's really important to point out that we must ensure that we both reduce pollution, particularly in the most impacted communities, and generate revenue to invest in those communities, because those communities will not have an opportunity to otherwise transition to a clean energy future. And we don't want to create the dynamic where the rest of the state is benefiting from clean energy investments and pollution reduction, and we're leaving certain communities behind. So moving forward, it's imperative that we achieve both goals at the same time. But finally, I just want to spend some time telling you about some of these things and what they look like on the ground. So we've been able to see now a bunch of investments coming into disadvantaged communities, and I just want to tell you about a couple of examples just to show that what this looks like when it comes to implementation. So I'll focus on a electric vehicle car share program that's being established in Los Angeles that will benefit low-income communities by providing clean mobility options. So the Air Resources Board gave a grant to the City of LA of $1.6 million and will be able to establish 100 car share vehicles targeted at low-income communities in the city of Los Angeles. The focus of the program is the neighborhoods of South LA, Westlake, Pico Union, Boyle Heights, and Koreatown. Some of the most low-income communities in Los Angeles that have a high representation of immigrants living in them. And it's estimated that this program will provide services to about 7,000 drivers. So hopefully those 7,000 drivers won't need to purchase a vehicle or rely on a polluting vehicle, thereby reducing emissions by 2,100 tons of carbon annually. So this is what we want to do. We want to reduce pollution and at the same time provide an opportunity for low-income communities to gain access to technology that otherwise they wouldn't be able to, and save money and improve their livability at the same time. This is the multiple co-benefit program that we're discussing. And as you'll hear from some of the other panelists, if we assure that co-benefits like good jobs, contracting opportunities are associated with these investments, we are really having a ripple effect in these communities that could be very, very beneficial. So another program that I want to tell you about is a zero-emission bus pilot program that was awarded to the San Joaquin Valley. So through this, 15 zero-emission buses are going to be placed in communities serving Fresno, Stockton, Modesto, and Visalia, with an expected pollution reduction of about 1,700 tons of carbon annually. $22 million was awarded to, it was required for this program, with $13.4 million coming from cap and trade. So this is yet another opportunity where we maximize clean mobility options for communities that need those mobility options in order to service the population. But we're doing so in a way that creates these ripple effects of co-benefits. We conducted a study with the Union of Concerned Scientists on looking at the electrification of the bus and truck sector and seeing where the health and economic benefits were associated with those investments. And what we see is that there's a lot of opportunity for good economic growth for low-income communities if we ensure that electrification of those sectors are targeted towards creating job and pathways out of poverty for low-income populations. There are good jobs in charging infrastructure, in the construction of these buses, and these are companies that are now moving to California because of the revenue that's available to invest in those companies. So moving forward, we want to make sure that not only are we targeting those investments for actual projects in the ground in those communities, but that the jobs and economic development associated with it is also targeted at those communities in order to maximize the impact. And the last thing that I'll talk about is something that we were involved with last year through the legislative cycle, which is called Transformative Climate Communities. This is basically taking all of the different programs that the state is investing in and coordinating and aligning those programs at a neighborhood scale in communities that are most polluted in California. So this past year, $140 million was allocated towards the Transformative Climate Communities Program, which is a neighborhood scale approach to sustainability. So imagine instead of having to apply for 6 or 7 different sources of funding, you apply to one source of fund to carry out your neighborhood scale sustainability plan. So if that involves green infrastructure, renewable energy, charging infrastructure, or other forms of mobility, you can carry out that vision without having to go through multiple cycles of funding. So we're really excited about this program. Fresno is going to be a big recipient of resources from that program. Los Angeles is going to see a large amount of investment. And moving forward, we want to make sure that this becomes a model for other cities to look at and really coordinate the work that they're doing in order to, again, maximize the potential impact that these revenues have. So that's it for me, and I hope I gave you a little bit of a taste of what this is looking at like on the ground, and I look forward to questions that folks may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Alvaro, for making it real. Next, we're going to turn to the private sector and my alma mater, Southern California Edison. Adam Smith is SCE's resident expert on state and federal climate policy. Before coming to Edison, Adam held positions at the UN Environment Program and UC Berkeley's Transportation Sustainability Center. So let's hear from Adam.
Great, thank you. I was joking around with Wendy before we started, since she led the Transportation Electrification Initiative at Edison for quite some time, that if I say anything crazy, you'd kick me under the table. But I'm afraid this is kind of visible, so they may see if you actually do kick me. Thanks for staying. I really appreciate it. I hope with the few minutes that I have to talk about a slightly different subset of auction proceeds. And these are revenues that are generated and accrue at the utility level and are directly sent back to our customers, or, and this is where I think it will maybe get slightly provocative and maybe interesting, the utilities can direct some of those funds towards clean energy investments. The second little, I guess, item I'd like to touch upon is the low carbon transportation funding stream, which we've seen a couple times here. I have maybe a few suggestions slash observations that I'd like to share. So first off, kind of just as maybe a way to level set, in the current cap and trade regulation, electric utilities receive a free allocation of allowances to protect our ratepayers from increased costs. The way that currently works out is that we receive a number of allowances that are anticipated to cover our expected emissions through a compliance period, in this case out to the year 2020. This is important because, as you could imagine, the electric sector plays a rather unique role in the state's long-term climate policy strategy. On one hand, we are anticipated, and if you look at the most recent scoping plan, by the year 2030, we will likely be somewhere around 41 to 61% below 1990 levels. And for reference, the industrial sector, not picking on anyone, but is something like 11 to 21% below 1990 levels in the year 2030 if the scoping plan is approved. And then at the same time, electricity is going to become a dominant end-use fuel. We have significant transportation electrification initiatives underway, incentive programs that we've just kind of seen up on the screen here. And at the same time, you have utilities like Edison investing in a pretty significant way in the infrastructure to serve that future electrification. So, on one hand, it's, I think, why the allowance allocation is so incredibly important for electric utilities and our customers is because there is this dual tension where the electric sector is going to be going, deeper, faster towards emission reductions. We have significant mandates, to be honest, stemming from Senate Bill 350 to achieve a 50% in RPS, the doubling of energy efficiency, and these are all, frankly, things that Southern California Edison has supported. We support the proposed scoping plan that would lead the electric sector further than the other sectors. But at the same time, we recognize that if we're going to keep electricity price competitive, and if we're going to keep electricity, or at least chart a pathway for electricity to be the end-use fuel of choice, we're going to have to make sure electricity prices and the costs passed along to our customers are reasonable and, as much as possible, mitigated. We don't want to be, it's a rather rough strategy to, try to incentivize transportation electrification at the same time you're making electricity more expensive. And we think that there's a way to do both, both decarbonize the electric sector faster, as well as spur transportation electrification without undue cost burden on our customers. So that is, kind of the one point I wanted to make, is that, on top of all this really great activity that's happening at the state level with the state auction proceeds, the electric utilities themselves are pretty engaged in trying to, I guess you would almost say, be part of the solution. We, number one, accepting the challenges that have been laid out before us, and at the same time, basically sticking up for the interests of our customers by trying to mitigate the cost impacts that flow through to them. The kind of interesting tidbit here is that auction proceeds that are accrued to the utilities, 15% of those can be utilized by the utilities for clean energy investments. Now this is, of course, it has to be approved by the California Public Utilities Commission. But there's been a lot of innovative thinking. The legislature has weighed in on some of this with a bill AB 693 from Eggman, which would create an incentive program for multifamily affordable housing solar installations. There's probably also some leftover funds that the utilities themselves can invest. I see Tim Tutt in the audience, and SMUD, I know, has used some of those auction proceeds to invest in electric vehicle chargers. And I think that as we go forward, this is kind of one of those additional funding streams, right? We all go to cocktail parties and people like to talk about how we're spending money, both state agency money and also utility funds. This is, I think, is one of those areas that's kind of ripe for innovative thinking. So if there are folks out there with ideas, I think we'd all love to hear them. If I could transition then just quickly, and I'll do this one pretty briefly, but we saw a lot of transportation, electrification, funding streams on the slides that we just witnessed, and I think there is a pretty clear kind of nexus. I think I just described it for the utility role here. Utilities, number one, we're the kind of infrastructure providers. And at the same time that there are these significant incentive programs or regulations like LCFS that are in play, trying to create an ecosystem of electric vehicle adoption, I think we probably can do maybe just a little bit better a job at coordinating. And I think getting to kind of the things you were talking about with the Transformative Climate Communities program, utilities will now have incentives that we can pass along through the sale of low carbon fuel standard credits. We have our own disadvantaged community programs, and what I really like, and I think this is, if I can sum up here a little bit, I think that there's a real opportunity for kind of being a laboratory for how these things work out. The Department of Energy released a really great study at the beginning of this year where they highlighted and tried to track the electric vehicle policy drivers. So what policies, if they really, what policies are doing the most work? What ones are, is it a HOV lane sticker? I'm sure we could, you could opine on this. Is it the, free electric vehicle charging at your workplace? There's all these policy drivers that we have in play, and I think what was really interesting, the solution they came up with is basically it's a bit of everything. You need to throw an ecosystem of policies and incentives and regulations at this problem, because frankly the challenge is so bold. In the scoping plan, the ARB is making recommendations that 100% of the new car sales in the state of California should be zero emission vehicles. They don't put a date on it yet, but people have thrown around dates. That's the end point. We see where it's going. Maybe it's just a matter of how long it takes us to get there. But if we're going to do it, we kind of need this rather robust ecosystem. And frankly, I'd suggest that I think we need to be a little experimental, and it's okay. It's difficult. You don't want to fund something in a community and then pull back that funding. There's obviously clear problems with that. I think it's a rather unjust outcome. But at the same time, I think we need to stay flexible enough, realizing that we're basically the laboratory for this stuff. Other countries, Northern European countries may have incredibly ambitious goals for electric vehicle deployment. But at the same time, we're kind of the lab for California, not just California, the United States. It's really, it's an opportunity for us to get pretty robust in defining, what success looks like and what kind of tools maybe other states, if they follow us, may want to adopt. So with that, I'll pass it along. Thanks.
Just one additional clarification. You mentioned specifically about the 15% of utility money, but you didn't say what the 85% goes to. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I'm sorry. That's probably the most important part. The 85% goes right. Yeah, it is, at least numerically. The 85% goes directly back to our customers via a twice yearly on-bill, quote-unquote, climate credit. For our customers, that totaled something like $40 about each time. And so we think that's kind of getting to the way in which the allowance allocation, the free allocation allowances to electric utilities, helps minimize the actual customer cost impacts. We pass the revenues directly through. So there is no, I do not get a bonus that is anywhere tied to these kinds of things. All the money and all the revenue is passed directly back to our customers or used for programs and investments that further the goals of AB 32.
Okay. So anybody out there who's an investor-owned utility customer should be seeing that on their bill.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, this month.
So, all right. So to fill in the gaps, we like to turn to the academic community for almost everything. And so we have one of my favorites here, Colleen Callahan. Colleen is the Deputy Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, where she's really spearheaded some terrific research. Do you have slides?
I don't.
She doesn't need the clicker. All right. Imagine that, an academic who doesn't rely on slides. Another reason she's one of my favorites. Prior to taking on this position at UCLA, she worked as the Manager of Air Quality Policy at the American Lung Association in California. So, Colleen.
Great, thanks, Wendy. Last speaker of the panel, last panel of a 3-day conference. It's hard to say anything new at this point, but I will speak from a researcher perspective, which is hopefully a little bit of a different perspective than you've gotten at other times of this conference. I'm going to talk about what we do and do not know about the quantified impacts of climate investment. So teeing off, or using kind of the tee-off that my panelists provided, I'll just kind of dive a little bit deeper into the benefits for real Californians. Ashley talked about GHG reductions. We have good estimates for that. We also have some estimates at the co-benefit level. So these are the additional environmental, health, and economic benefits. But a lot of co-benefits are still undefined when it comes to their actual impact. They sometimes go undocumented due to the difficulty quantifying them. So to fill in some of the gaps, the UCLA Luskin Center has been trying to quantify some of these co-benefits for Californians. And at the same time, the state is ramping up, because we're still fairly in the early days, but ramping up efforts to create kind of a more robust system to help applicants and administering agencies of climate investments to really monitor results and quantify the impact. So first, I'll talk about some economic co-benefits. The Luskin Center conducted a study of the financial impact of cap and trade and some of its complementary measures. And we found that climate investments are actually helping Californians to save money. And when it comes to cap and trade, we found that the state has very effectively put in place many protective measures, including climate investments, that are effectively protecting low-income Californians financially as we transition to a low-carbon economy. In fact, we actually quantified modest financial gains for low-income Californians during the implementation of the cap and trade program. And so these protective measures that we looked at include the climate credits that Adam mentioned that are going directly to ratepayers. It also includes, of course, like I mentioned, climate credits and other climate measures, efficiency measures, fuel switching, and VMT reducing measures that are helping Californians to reduce their expenditures on electricity, natural gas, and gasoline. And I think this was an important finding. It's putting money into the pockets of Californians that need it the most. Another important climate or economic co-benefit is job creation. So we are wrapping up a study that looks at the economic, the employment impacts of climate investments. And we're using an economic input-output model. The inputs are climate investment dollars at the program and project level, plus co-investments. So this is local match funds. And then the output are job numbers, job years. And we're finding that climate investments have relatively high job multipliers compared to benchmark industries like oil and gas. So this means that climate investments generate significantly more jobs per dollar than alternative investments. At the aggregate level, we're finding that the appropriated dollars for climate investments thus far are on track to generate tens of thousands of jobs in California. And we're also going to be doing really soon, results released very soon, a prospective forecast in which we look at different potential auction revenue amounts, and then again what that would mean for job creation. It's really important, I know it's been discussed at this conference, but to talk about how climate goals and air quality goals are linked. Air quality co-benefits are really critical for climate investments, for all climate measures. Something's hard to measure. The relationship, it's complicated between GHG reductions and reductions of a criteria and toxic contaminants. It's not always perfectly correlated one-to-one. Yet many strategies that reduce GHGs will also reduce local air pollution. And I'll just mention one last study that UCLA is involved with. We are quantifying both GHG and criteria pollutant emission reductions for climate measures under the AB 32 scoping plan. And we're doing this retrospectively and prospectively, just like that employment study I mentioned earlier. So we're using sophisticated models, and then we're getting emissions results, translating that into exposure, morbidity and mortality, and then finally the economic value of those health benefits. And preliminary findings underscore that climate goals can definitely complement air quality goals, and in fact they need to. We need to be doing both what's good for the planet and what is good for people locally, and I think the merger of the two is just becoming closer over time. But there's still so much that we don't know. We certainly could do a similar study like this specifically for climate investments. There's also so much we don't know about. The data could certainly be improved. We don't know as much as I would like us to know about pollution hotspots. This could be addressed, I think, pretty cost effectively now that community monitors, the monitoring equipment is becoming much less expensive. If we had a statewide system of community-based, real-time air monitors linked to our regional monitors, I think some of the conversations that we are having right now we wouldn't need to be having. So I just want to go back to the importance of climate investments for disadvantaged communities. We've been talking about that throughout this panel. We know that the state has surpassed the targets for investments in and for disadvantaged communities, but there's definitely more that needs to be done for the communities most impacted by poverty and pollution. Levels are still unacceptable, and we need to know more about how programs can be best targeted to improve conditions in those communities. We produced a guide to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund for disadvantaged communities, and one of our recommendations was to think across sectors and to achieve co-benefits that address multiple state goals and do so at a neighborhood level. And the Transformative Climate Communities program that Alvaro discussed is, I think, a good example of this type of strategy moving forward. I look forward to it expanding. It's an exciting and important year for climate investments, and we'll see how things go.
Great, thanks, Colleen. So as moderator, I'm going to ask at least one question of the ladies and gentlemen of the view before I throw it out to you. Probably for Ashley and Alvaro, but anyone else could jump in. What do you think might be the real world ramifications of the kind of shortfall, the real and perceived shortfall of funding that we've seen given the recent auction results? What does that do to some of these programs when they see kind of the stop and go funding? Somebody want to take it?
So we've already seen some of this. We saw that we funded some programs within the Department of Fish and Wildlife in the past to do wetlands investments and some mountain meadow investments. And this year, the legislature did not appropriate funds for that purpose. And so, we started up a program. We went through the process to develop quantification methodology, expenditure records. We staffed that program. And then now there's no additional appropriations to it. So internally, there's obviously an impact, and there's a cost to the state as well in standing up a program and then essentially walking away from it. So that's kind of the practical implementation. But then there's also a watershed implication where maybe we're investing in forests upstream, we're investing in communities downstream, but we're missing the middle. And so when it comes to water quality and providing water quality to the state, we're missing those watersheds and mountain meadows along the way. And that's a very practical implication when we've got a lot of water this year. So that's a big deal. And then additionally, there's a political issue associated with stopping and starting funding as well, because it's hard the money comes to us, and then we have a couple of years of getting it out the door, and then several years of monitoring it. And when we have to report back annually to the legislature, it doesn't look that great to say, we started a program and we stopped it, or we funded it at a much lower level the next year. So we've been trying to be pretty circumspect and putting small amounts of funding in programs that are newer, and then investing in existing programs where we know we get the emissions reductions, so that we can do both. We can show this steady emissions reduction or emission decline as a result of these programs, but also show innovation and show that innovation can work in this space. We can always improve the program, and it's an annual improvement. Every year we're working with people to constantly improve the program. But in terms of the auction proceeds, obviously the more certainty we have, the better. And so, when it comes to getting a 2/3 vote in the legislature and helping people understand that these auction proceeds actually provide a benefit to them, and that if we continue with this sort of market mechanism, they'll see these benefits, I think that will only help us increase certainty and potentially see more of these proceeds. But as we heard earlier, it's not about the money, it's about the emissions reductions, and that's ultimately what we have to show.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I would say that implementation on the ground is trust and confidence in the overall program. Everybody here knows that very well. All of the different programs are always oversubscribed, heavily oversubscribed. So all of these things are very new and complex in order to submit applications. So for those folks who submitted an application, were not successful, and are expecting to submit an application the year after because they maybe learned some things and would like to actually get funded, when that goes to zero, they're like, well, all that work that went into learning how to do this, it's just out the window. Why should we continue to do it? On the other hand, some of the customer-facing programs, you barely learned about an EV voucher that you could gain access to, and you apply, and then you're told, there's a waiting list, and you can't get it. And then the next year, there's no resources for it, so who knows when you're going to get it. So it's just the confidence. Folks are just like, why do this if we're not going to see the direct benefits quickly? So I think it's just the confidence in the program, which then, if you add it to the confidence about whether or not we're reducing pollution, it creates a recipe that's really not a good one that we want to continue moving forward. So confidence on both fronts, on having a program that invests in a sustainable way, but also a program that does achieve the global and local pollution reduction is really, really important moving forward.
Great, thanks. I have more, but I want to reserve time for the audience. So are there questions out there? None? Tim?
This money has been appropriated.
Yeah, I think I had a slide on that. It's probably a third at this point, 1.2, 1.3. So, because we reported 900 million last year. Actually, it's more than that. It's probably about half at this point. And then we have a lot more that will go out the door, hopefully within the next 6 months. But we're pushing. Every week we meet with the agencies and really push on trying to get out the door. But again, we want to do it with the best process possible.
Anyone else? Because I'm going to jump in. Okay, I have a question for any of you. When the program was first adopted, there was this expectation that several other jurisdictions would quickly follow on. And while we've got Reggie in the Northeast and, a few others considering, that hasn't really happened. Are there other ways that you think California's leadership has kind of manifested itself, particularly in this new era where there's little support and a lot of opposition coming out of Washington? Or what do you think is happening in terms of the likelihood others are going to follow, and how is California's leadership important? Okay.
Yeah, so I'll share that. When it comes to cap and invest in that strategy, we're definitely seeing that happening. Other states that are considering carbon pricing, such as Seattle and Washington, Oregon and Washington, there's constant communication back and forth around that strategy. How do we achieve this? And I think that particularly this question around placing equity at the core of a pollution reduction program is something that California is leading in. A lot of the work that we've done, I think, is leading towards that. We're also seeing that specific programs are gaining traction in other states. So a colleague of mine went to Oregon, where they're considering electric vehicle incentives, and they really wanted to learn about the low income and moderate income programs that California has. So a plug for our website, we have a toolkit, an electric vehicle equity toolkit on our website that talks about the policies that we've been able to pass and talks about the programs that we have operating in California, not greenlining, but the state. And I feel like little bits and pieces are starting to replicate. And the last one that I'll mention is something very similar to Transformative Climate Communities, which is PARC. And this is a philanthropy government initiative, very similar in terms of investing in neighborhood scale sustainability. They selected 10 cities across the United States, and I'm really interested in seeing how we can take the learnings from Transformative Climate Communities here in California and match those up with what they're doing and generate kind of a cohort of folks who are taking this approach to sustainability. So I think what we're doing already is definitely impacting other folks.
I'll let Ashley go in a moment, but I mean, one of the things that just, I think consistently you hear people say, historically the allowance prices in the cap and trade program have been just bouncing off the floor, and maybe they're not incentivizing any behavior. You kind of hear this refrain, and it's for anyone who works in the electric sector or has a view at power markets, it's just radically transformed the way our electricity system functions and the way power gets dispatched. And so in one of these thinking through areas of leadership where this hasn't been a carbon market linkage, instead you have an industry who's really had to internalize the price of greenhouse gases into its decision making. And I can't tell you how many phone calls I get from folks in other states who are, their regulators are contemplating something. They say, well, how the heck did you guys do that? How did you figure this one out? I think, so while there maybe isn't this full head-on linkage, of cap and trade programs, I think this leadership just kind of happens, everywhere. It's kind of unique. I think it happens in the electric sector, transportation electrification, just the models for how we spend these revenues.
Okay.
Yeah, Jessica.
I think that when it comes to California's influence, you have a couple of different levels. At the base level, you have information sharing, and that's a lot of what all of us do, is that we're information sharing with other states, with other institutions, with other nations, and with jurisdictions around the world. And then you have, memorandum of understanding that we have signed, California has signed with, there's a website that basically lists everything we've signed under this administration and the one before, and that we actually deliver on. So we have working groups with Mexico, we have working groups with Norway and Sweden, we work with Canada really actively on aligning our programs. And then beyond that, you have a direct link, and we have a direct link already with Quebec, and we're working on a link right now with Ontario, and we've been hearing from the Reggie states about interest in linking more of the transportation sector because they already have their own electricity sector. And as you heard, with the Pacific Coast Coast Collaborative and states on the West Coast, there's also an interest in joining parts of the program as well. And so I think when it comes to California, what we need to continue to do is develop real programs where as we reduce emissions, a ton is a ton. It's measured, it's appropriate, it's efficient, it's cost effective, it benefits communities, and that will allow others to join us when they're ready. And my boss frequently comments that he had no idea that we would need a State Department when he started his job, but we essentially are all of us, whether you're inside the state or outside the state in terms of government, you're an ambassador for California, and people want to hear what we're doing and want to engage with us. So I'm not from California, but I've apparently drunk the Kool-Aid, because I think what we're doing is really great, and despite what's happening in DC, we'll continue along this path. And you heard our fiery governor yesterday, who's really looking to all of you and all of us to continue to show that what we're doing is working. And we'll gain partners along the way. Again, whether it's through a conversation or through a direct link, it all really, really matters. And it's about building trust around the world that climate programs are important, and they're beneficial for people, and they're beneficial for ecosystems, and they're beneficial for financial markets worldwide.
Great, thanks. I have one last question for all of you, and I'll switch from the View to Oprah this time, since we'll talk about money. The program is in the midst of readoption, reform, whatever you want to call it. And if you were Oprah, and you could give every one of these people a car.
It would be electric. Yeah, that's right.
It would be electric. There you go. But if you could decide how the program were to be changed, and we'll focus on the funding. We have a big chunk of the program that's continuously appropriated. If that's lingo for you, it means we know exactly how the money's going to be spent every year in certain areas. I mean, where do you see that there's shortfalls, or if you could change how the money's spent, how would you do it? I mean, what would you change about the program based on what you know, where the needs are? What do you think makes sense in terms of bringing in money and putting it out the door again? And why don't we start with Colleen?
Well, this year there's a new appropriation for technical assistance at large for a variety of programs, climate investment programs, and I think that's exciting. The goal is to reach disadvantaged communities and help them to submit grant applications, and I think efforts like that can help achieve multiple state goals. While, of course, just increasing capacity at the local level. I had mentioned the need for kind of improved data over time, and that we're still early days in all of this, and that I think that will happen. But the need to, I think, do more linkages between GHG and local air pollution co-benefits. I think that really revolves also around a need for improved data.
Thanks.
I would say a couple things. One is for stationary investments of the funds, I would probably add some air quality monitoring equipment to those stationary investments so that we can collect more of this data. So that's one practical thing I'd like to see and we're working on for this year. And then also from program design, I would love to have a one-stop shop center application website where everyone can, we wanted this from the start, but there's so much demand to get the money out the door, we had to kind of go with this disparate approach or distributed approach. So I would go with a common app and with kind of a choose your own adventure, which programs work for you, and a one-stop shop for technical assistance as well.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, if I can completely follow up on that point, I think the one-stop shop is an absolutely wonderful idea, and frankly, I think you'd find at least this electric utility very interested in quote-unquote stacking our disadvantaged programs. You know, we have programs that benefit disadvantaged communities. Some are geographically targeted, some are just qualified by income, but I think that the building of that kind of platform could be super, super helpful, because it doesn't make a lot of sense in my view, and I think maybe it's a feeling that's shared amongst some of us, that, you know, to go out and knocking doors door to door, 5 people from 5 different organizations trying to sign somebody up is kind of a bad way to go about this. Trying to tell somebody, go to my website and then go to your website and then go to this website. If we're providing these programs, why don't we just maximize the ability for people to sign up for them? And so that's one thing. Completely agree on that. I think the other item, is, and just hearing it actually, was this idea that maybe with the funding ebbs and flows, you lose a bit of trust. And so while everyone wants continuous appropriation for their thing, right? If my thing is forest protection, I want continuous appropriation for that. But I do think maybe we should get a little bit more serious about if the ebbs and flow of program funding could create some kind of trust gap in some of these localized communities, where they have localized impacts from criteria pollutants and all this other stuff. Maybe we should just try to focus on keeping cash there and say, there's other programs that we may not suffer from this trust gap if we do reduce funding over there. It's just an interesting way to view it. I hadn't heard that before. It sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, I have a lot of We could
Take us home,
longer than 1 minute. But I'll keep it to 1 minute. I completely agree with the suggestions, and I'll mention, I guess, 2. Number 1 is right now all of these resources are going to climate mitigation. That's what they're intended for. But if there was flexibility to allow for investments in climate adaptation, I think we should definitely take the opportunity to do so. And also really focus on a just transition, meaning what's going to happen to displaced workers and how do we train them up and allow them to benefit from clean energy economy. And then the second one, which is to the contending with the ebbs and flow, we do have a 3-year investment plan. It's not attached to money. And I think it'll be very difficult to have to further encumber the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund by increasing the continuous appropriation amounts. But if that 3-year investment plan was a 3-year investment funded plan, and we didn't have to worry about every year the investment cycle, and we just had chunks of 3 years, I think that would be a really great benefit to contend with this ebb and flow funding. So, I think that it provide a lot of certainty. So those are the 2 that I'll just share for now.
Great, thanks. I think we have solved a lot of problems here today. And yes, and I want to thank you guys for sticking it out this late on a Friday.
Yeah.
Exactly. Thanks to this great panel, and with that, you're free to go.
Yeah.
And thanks to Wendy.
Yes.
Yeah.